The following is from Maurice Nicoll's book, The Mark. This is the parable of the sower, part 1. In the Lord's Prayer we are told to say, "May thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Earth psychologically means that part of a man built in him by the senses. This is earth in him psychologically. Man is governed by what he sees. The will of heaven is not done in this earth in him. He must learn to understand apart from the senses. In all that follows, one thing must be kept in mind, namely, man's relation to esoteric teaching that is sown from a higher level in mankind. The categories of man described in the following pages refer to categories of men in their relationship to esoteric ideas, those who cannot understand them, and those who understand them wrongly, and those who actually understand and follow them. Man is created as a self-developing organism, as a seed that can grow upwards in the vertical scale of being, and from the higher level that creates man comes all esoteric teaching, that is, the eternal teaching about man and his possible inner evolution and the means whereby this can be attained. When a person takes everything literally, it means that he is using one level of thinking, the lowest or most external level. At this level, the outer world meets his senses and his thinking is placed here. His eyes behold objects illuminated by the physical light of the sun, and his mind forms ideas from these objects, from all he sees and hears and touches round him. His ideas are thus derived from visible, tangible objects. He thinks from these ideas, for everyone thinks and can only think from the ideas he possesses. Thus, ordinarily, all the ideas of a person's mind are founded on things in the world, that is, his mind is moulded on the things revealed to him by the senses. This is the literal mind. This level of the mind cannot get away from things. Only things and ideas derived from things are real to it. Take away from it the ideas derived from the world of things, and its thought would be destroyed. Or give to this level of the mind the idea, let us say, that time is a dimension in which the past and future is extended, and it will make nothing of it, because it can only think from what it sees. This lowest level of the mind, which thinks naturally from appearance, is the first mind formed in us, and it is of the greatest importance because it relates us to external life. But this level of mind must be used for what it is meant to be used for. It must not be used for ideas that are not derived from appearances. There are other levels of the mind, not opened up by the external senses, and to these levels other ideas and ways of thought belong. Let us take the simplest possible example of what it means to think from the senses, that is, naturally, literally, or from appearances, and what it means to think from a slightly higher level of mind. From appearances, that is, according to the evidence of our senses, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. A man, thinking naturally, would swear that this is so. Yet, thinking from a slightly higher level, and so against appearances, this is not true. The earth rotates and makes it appear that the sun rises and sets, but no one sees the earth rotating. We see instead the sky apparently rotating, and therefore naturally think it swings round the earth every 24 hours. This is natural or mechanical thinking, based on what the senses show, that is, on appearances. It belongs to the literal mind that thinks in terms of things and the ideas derived from them. Now, it is very important that a man should learn to distinguish between different categories of ideas. He must eventually come to know what it means to think in different categories. See Ouspensky, A New Model of the Universe, page 324. A man cannot develop inwardly in himself otherwise. If he does not learn that ideas belong to different categories, he will mix up ideas belonging to different scales, and they will come into collision and seem contradictory. There are different kinds of ideas of different levels, and levels cannot mix. The very idea of levels is that things are different and cannot be mixed up and must be kept distinct. All esoteric ideas are on a level above the level of the mind that thinks naturally, according to the appearance of things. It is impossible to understand these ideas on the most mechanical, literal level of the mind. Yet at the same time they must to some extent fall first on this level, for no one can think in a new way unless he starts from what he knows and understands already. Very many problems exist in regard to the teaching of esotericism. Esoteric ideas lie far beyond natural ideas, yet some connection must be made. This is one of the problems of esotericism, namely to find how it is possible to convey ideas of a higher category, belonging to a higher level of the mind, to those people who think naturally, literally from the senses, from things as they appear. In the Gospels, a bridge was effected by means of parables. Part 2. A parable is a medium of connection between a lower and a higher meaning, but it is necessary to look more closely at the basis of parables and the reason they exist. In ancient teaching, man is taken as a link between a higher and a lower world, between heaven and earth. Man lives physically on earth by the light of the sun, but psychologically he lives by the light received by his level of understanding, which is light from heaven, a far more wonderful light. As a man grows in understanding, he stands more in this light, and it can be said that it is only by means of receiving some fraction of this light that a man can think at all. A language exists that was once known that connects man on the level of the earth with man on the level of heaven. It is in this language that parables are cast. It is a specific language, speaking in terms of earthly objects, of meanings that these earthly objects represent at a higher level. In this language, everything on earth represents something belonging to the understanding. Objects represent ideas. All physical things have definite psychological meanings, not arbitrary subjective meanings invented by man, but objective meanings, that is, meanings quite apart from man's subjective associations. Everything created on the earth has a true, a real, objective significance, because it represents something at a higher level that only the understanding can grasp. If a man were fully awake, he would see the objective meaning of all things around him. It would be enough if he were fully awake in the emotional center, that is, if he were conscious in the higher emotional center. The higher emotional center is a world above us. The language of the higher emotional center is the language of the parable. It is the language of vision. It is, for instance, the language in which the book of Revelation is written. In this strange book, the language is cast in the image of the senses. We read of horses, trumpets, swords, stars, sun, moon, kings, wars, pestilences, and so on, and think it means literally these objects. Its meaning lies in what these earthly objects represent in this lost language that still exists in us. This language was once known and understood and made deliberate use of in myths, legends, parables, and in other ways. The emotional center was once awake in man. He then walked and talked with God. He named everything created. That is, he knew what every object represented. And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them into Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. Genesis chapter 2, verses 19. If man were awake in the higher emotional center, through its illumination he would see the significance of all things. He would see things as they really are. He would know the properties, qualities, and the use of all things. He would know what everything represented. He would perceive the ideas that each physical object represents. He would pass from a world of physical things into a world of supernatural, inconceivable meaning. he would be in a state of objective consciousness. Part 3. Every word used in a parable in the Gospels or in a description of a miracle has a special meaning, belonging to this language which connects the visible things of the world with the understanding of the mind of the higher emotional centre. A parable is only alive when it is based on this language, for then it has connection with higher levels. Everything literal that is constructed rightly in terms of this language conducts force from higher levels, and so has life in it. This is the basis of miracles, for a miracle is brought about by attracting the laws of a higher world to act in a lower world. It was the reason for ritual, only ritual has lost its meaning partly because, to be effective, that is, to conduct force, not only an emotional understanding of its meaning is necessary, but a certain emotional state must be reached. For example, the laying on of hands was a ritual based on this lost language. The hands represent power, and laying on represents contact. But as a mere ritual act, nothing curative can result. But ritual itself has great importance. Things had to be done in the right way in order to correspond with this language, otherwise force could not be transmitted. The case is somewhat like ordinary language. If you arrange the words rightly, they conduct meaning. It is the basis of objective art. A parable is an example of objective art. By being rightly arranged, it conducts permanent or eternal meaning, and it will be understood by everyone strictly according to his level of being. That is, it will grow in meaning as a man grows in the level of his understanding. At the lowest natural level of the mind, a parable will be understood literally. It will seem merely to be a story about some shepherd or some spendthrift son and so on, and an actual king or shepherd or son will be thought of, and perhaps a scholar will make researches to find out who, historically, is referred to. One has only to read the more modern commentaries on the New Testament to realize how literally everything in the Gospels can be taken. In ancient times there was better understanding. Let us begin with what is called the parable of parables in the Gospels. It is the first parable given in Matthew and appears in the 13th chapter. Up to that point in this Gospel, the teaching of Christ is presented in the form of discourses, such as the Sermon on the Mount. Then, quite abruptly, Jesus begins to teach in parables. The first parable is a key parable, because Christ says to his disciples, unless they can understand this parable, how can they expect to understand any other parable? This is not recorded in the version given in Matthew, but in the account of the same parable in Mark chapter 4, where Christ says to the disciples, "Know ye not this parable? And how then will ye know all the parables?" Verse 13. This key parable is the parable of the sower and the seed. It is given in Matthew chapter 13, Mark chapter 4, and Luke chapter 8, but not in John, because the Gospel of John is quite differently written and came from another school. Let us begin with the version in Matthew. It is sometimes important to notice the introduction to a parable. In this case, the introduction is as follows. On that day went Jesus out of the house, and sat by the seaside. And there was gathered unto him great multitudes, so that he entered into a boat, and sat. And all the multitude stood on the beach. And he spake many things to them in parables. Now this can be taken literally, but it has another meaning. That is, apart from its literal sense meaning, it has a psychological meaning. The sea is sometimes used in the language of parables as meaning something distinct from the earth. That is, the meaning here is that Christ is speaking of things not belonging to the earthly literal understanding of man, but of things at first sight incomprehensible to the sense-based understanding. He is speaking from another level, and so is represented as not being on earth, but on the sea, close to the beach. Different categories of ideas belong to different levels of understanding, and these different levels, in the natural language of the senses, are represented in different ways, as by a mountain as distinct from the ground, or by the sea as distinct from the land. The opening of the parable of the sower as given in Matthew is, "And he spake many things unto them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went forth to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them." Chapter 13, verses 3, 4. Let us take only this part of the parable and try to understand its meaning. It so happens that this parable is one of the parables that is given some interpretation by Christ. The disciples ask what the parable means, and also why he speaks in parables. Let us leave out for the moment Christ's explanation of why he speaks in parables, and take his interpretation of the first part. It is as follows: "Hear ye then the parable of the sower. When any one heareth the word of the kingdom, and understandeth it not, then cometh the evil one, and snatcheth away that which hath been sown in his heart. This is he that was sown by the wayside." You will notice that in the last line it says, "This is he that was sown by the wayside." It refers to man, to a certain kind of man. Man is the seed, yet seed is also defined as word of the kingdom. This, of course, refers to the teaching of the kingdom of heaven, which is expressly said elsewhere to be in a man. Christ said to the Pharisees, on being asked when the kingdom of God would come, "The kingdom of God cometh not with observation, neither shall they say, Lo here, or Lo there, for behold, the kingdom of God is within you." Luke chapter 17, verse 20. The seed that is sown is therefore both the teaching of esotericism, the teaching of the possible inner evolution of man to a higher level called heaven, and it is also man himself, for it says here, "This is he that was sown by the wayside." In all esoteric teaching, man is regarded as a seed. It is said of man in this respect that unless he dies to himself he cannot bear fruit. When Jesus heard that certain Greeks had come to speak with him, he said that his hour was at hand. Why did he say this when the Greeks came? Here is the strange passage which is found in John's Gospel only. "Now there were certain Greeks among those that went up to worship at the feast. These therefore came to Philip, which was of Bethsaida of Galilee, and asked him, saying, Sir, we would see Jesus. Philip cometh and telleth Andrew. Andrew cometh and Philip, and they tell Jesus. And Jesus answereth them, saying, The hour is come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a grain of wheat fall into the earth and die, it abideth by itself alone. But if it die, it beareth much fruit. He that loveth his life shall lose it, and he that hateth his life in this world shall keep it until life eternal." John chapter 12, verses 20 to 25. And this passage is strangely interesting, for it was a fact that in the Greek Orphic mysteries, the green ear of wheat, that is the seed, was a central idea in this little-known teaching. The ear of wheat represented man. This passage shows a very definite connection between the older Greek schools and the drama of Christ, but for some reason none of the commentators on the New Testament seem to realize that this is so. Man is a seed, and esotericism itself is a seed. But when a man hears the ideas of esotericism and does not understand them, the birds come and devour them. Birds represent something definite in this language of parables. They are, in general, false. You meet in Plato the image that the mind of a man is a birdcage, for example. The chief theme of the Aeticus is this birdcage. It is a bird cage which all sorts of birds enter and leave. If a man hears the ideas of esotericism and does not understand them, it means he has false or wrong thoughts, and these false thoughts, like birds, devour the ideas or alter them, twist them and make lies out of them. That is, the ideas are devoured by false thought. False thinking is the evil one. This is the meaning of the devil in regard to the mind, and everyone can see this in himself. Everyone who is sincere in his self-observation knows what power a lie has, and how he must struggle against lying in himself, taking things wrongly, giving a false meaning to what has happened, and so on. Birds here therefore mean false thinking, but they can also mean right thinking. The prophet Elijah was fed by ravens in the wilderness, and the ravens brought him bread and flesh in the morning, and bread and flesh in the evening, and he drank of the brook. 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 6. Here birds mean the same thing, but in the opposite sense. He was fed by right thoughts, by right understanding. Wrong understanding destroys us all internally. Right understanding nourishes us all. Man is a seed sown on the earth, and esotericism is a seed sown in man to awaken the seed that man is into life. The first category of man described here is a man who is sown by the wayside. Such a man cannot understand the ideas of esotericism, or misunderstands and falsifies them. People as seeds are sown into the world differently, and their power of understanding varies according to where they are sown. Part 4. We have now to think of the strange idea that men are differently sown into the earth, in the light of the parable of the sower and the seed as given in the version of Matthew. I will quote again the first part of the parable. Behold, the sower went forth to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. After Christ had told his disciples in reply to their question why he spoke in parables, that it was given to them to understand the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but not to the multitude, he says, Hear ye then the parable of the sower. When any one heareth the word of the kingdom, and understandeth it not, then cometh the evil one, and snatcheth away that which hath been sown in his heart. This is he that was sown by the wayside. Matthew chapter 13 verses 18-19. It is the last sentence which is strange. This is he that was sown by the wayside. It is strange because it implies that man is sown differently into life. That is, men have not the same opportunities for understanding esotericism. Christ has already said that the multitude cannot understand the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but that his disciples can, for he has said to the latter, Blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. Verse 16. And this, of course, does not mean the literal eyes and ears, the actual sense organs. The eyes mean the inner sight of the mind, and the ears the hearing of the emotions, i.e. the emotional understanding. For only the mind can see the truth of a thing, and only the emotional centre its value and good. But in Christ's interpretation of the parables he extended this idea that only some out of many can understand and follow his teaching, and defined 6 classes or categories of people. The first category are those who hear the word, that is, the teaching and ideas of esotericism, and the idea of conscious man, and the idea of self-evolution to that state called the kingdom of heaven, which is the conscious circle of humanity, and understand nothing about it. Their eyes and ears are open to life, to the world, to the things of the senses, that is, intellectually and emotionally, they only know the world. And this is not their fault, because it is said that such a man is he that is sown by the wayside. Such a man is entirely in life. He is glued to his senses, as it is put in the Greek teaching of Socrates, and ideas that pass beyond the range of the senses are shut to him because he can only think naturally, literally, in terms of things. And this point is further emphasized in this language of parables which we are studying in the version given in Luke, chapter 8, verse 5. The sower went forth to sow his seed, and as he sowed, some fell by the wayside, and it was trodden under foot, and the birds of the heaven devoured it. You will notice that a sentence is added here to the same passage as given in Matthew. The seed fell by the wayside and was trodden under foot. Let us speak of the meaning of underfoot. The foot is where a man touches the external world, registered by the senses, and in the language of parables represents the most natural, literal, external, sense-based level in a man's mind. That is, the part of the mind that thinks directly from this source. The ritual of washing the feet means, for one thing, to cleanse the natural mind from the fallacies of the senses, that is, from appearances, from life as it appears. In John, chapter 13, verse 14, after he had washed the disciples' feet, it is recorded that Christ said, "If you know these things, happy are ye if ye do them." If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, ye also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that ye should do as I have done to you. Verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither he that is sent greater than he that sent him. If you know these things, happy are ye if ye do them. But if a man cannot think and understand apart from the evidence of his senses, he cannot cleanse the natural mind. He can then neither think of nor yet understand anything about the ideas of esotericism. For you must always remember that esotericism begins from something none of the external senses shows us, namely the invisible oneself. It begins not with the observation of the external world, but with self-observation, with the invisible world of oneself. And I believe it would be a very good thing if you would try to see what is meant here and understand clearly that to observe oneself is not a matter of the external eyes or ears or of touching yourself and so on, but an inner thing beyond the range of the outer senses. When Christ said, "The kingdom of heaven cometh not by observation," Luke chapter 17 verse 20, he meant it is not something outside, something observable by the external senses, but internal, namely a stage of inner evolution above us and in ourselves in the vertical scale of possible being, and the beginning of it is to observe yourself in the light of the ideas and teaching of esotericism. For then you begin to understand why, as you are, the kingdom of heaven is not attainable, and that a very great deal of work on oneself is necessary over a very long period before it is possible to dream of such an attainment. How far we are from the kingdom of heaven, but how wonderful it is to begin to see the way to it. And this is what esoteric ideas can show to everyone who seeks it and treasures it. How wonderful it is to understand that mechanical goodness cannot lead to it any more than mechanical badness. How wonderful it is to begin to realize what it means to work against one's own mechanicalness. To return to the idea contained in the phrase trodden underfoot, taking the foot as the natural, literal level of a man where he rests on the earth, it is then possible to see the meaning of the wayside. The seed falls by the wayside and is trodden underfoot. What is the wayside? Psychologically, it is where the traffic of life goes on in you. It is all your mechanical thoughts. It is your mechanical side, the mechanical part of you turned to life, to the senses. It is impossible for this mechanical part, that is, the part which works almost automatically from life, to understand esoteric ideas. If these ideas fall on this mechanical part, they fall by the wayside. They fall on the wrong place in a man, a place useful for life but useless for self-development. Let me remind you, a man must be able to think in different categories. He must think of his affairs in life. He must think of esoteric ideas. But he must not think in the same category of life affairs and of the ideas of esotericism. He must know and see that they are different in quality, and if he cannot see that they are different, then he has no magnetic centre. Esotericism is about living in life, but it is not of life. Its source is not from life. If it were, it could not lift you above life, above mechanicalness. How can what originates in life lift you above life? Esotericism is a rope above life. The magnetic centre in a man means his power of distinguishing between influences which are life influences and created within the sphere of life, and influences which come from conscious man, from outside life. A man must be able, for example, to distinguish between the football news or war news and esoteric ideas, and not let them contradict and destroy one another. If you have no sense of scale, and a sense of scale is one of the meanings of having magnetic centre, then everything will be contradictory simply because you do not put things where they belong on the right level, but mix them all up on the same level. That is, you have no feeling of the vertical arm of the cross, which represents different levels and different categories, in short, higher and lower, and so more conscious and more mechanical levels in you. And remember that if you want to be in more conscious parts of yourself, you get there by directed attention to begin with. The whole idea of esotericism is to make us first of all more conscious, more aware of what we are thinking and feeling and saying and doing, and the object of this is to get us to live in more conscious parts of ourselves, which in most people are unoccupied or almost so. And self-observation is an act of internal attention. The object of esotericism is to lift us in the vertical scale of being. Magnetic centre is therefore something in a man that gives him the first feeling of things above and things below, or things more internal and more external, and relates him to the idea of the vertical scale of things, however dimly. For the vertical is internal, and everything higher in the vertical scale is more internal in man. It is like a little machine in him that, like a small lift, works upwards and downwards. A man with magnetic centre, therefore, will not only understand literally and naturally, but will catch the meaning of what is above the literal and natural level. That is, he will understand internal meaning apart from external meaning. This is the starting point of everything else in a man's evolution. And if a man does not possess this little machine, then he is one of those sown into the world, who hearing the ideas of esotericism makes nothing of them. You will see, therefore, that the first category or class of people spoken of in the parable are those who have not magnetic centre. It is expressly said that they are sown by the wayside. And in the version in Luke it is put more strongly. Christ is represented here as saying of this first category, "The seed is the word of God, and those by the wayside are they that have heard. Then cometh the devil, and taketh away the word from their heart, that they may not believe and be saved." Notice the last sentence, that they may not believe and be saved. What does this mean? Everyone cannot be saved. The word of God is the teaching of esotericism, that is, the teaching of the means of self-evolution, of what you must think and do to begin to evolve in yourself to the level of conscious man or the kingdom of heaven. You must grasp the meaning of one analogy here. There is an ancient Hermetic saying, "As above, so below." This means that everything is stamped by the laws that prevail throughout the created universe. What you find on a great scale, you find represented on a small scale, as above, so below. There is an analogy in the human body. The human body represents in itself the ideas of conscious man and mechanical man. The brain cells, so shut off and isolated, represent the conscious circle of cells in regard to the rest of the body. They are immortal in terms of the body. Now, if all the body cells tried to become brain cells, that is, evolve to the level of brain cells, the body would break up. It would cease to be able to be a body and perform its functions as such. But a few cells out of the billions and billions of living cells composing the body can escape without disorganizing it. That is, a certain number of body cells can become brain cells without upsetting the work of the body as a whole. It is the same in regard to the life of nature, which is a great body. Certain cells in it, that is, in this case, the human beings, can escape from its laws without disorganizing its general function and purposes. If you think, you will see what is meant. And one thing can be added here. The number of those who at any particular time can begin to escape from the service of nature are more than those who seek to do so. It is this thought that helps one to understand the situation. Otherwise people, first hearing this explanation and not trying to see its real significance, are inclined to say that it is not just or fair. And I know that some of you will say something like this. In this passage quoted from Luke, it says that the devil comes and takes away the seed, lest they should believe and be saved. It looks as if some evil force prevented people from awakening. That seems to be unfair and unjust, etc. I will try to answer this. In the version given in Matthew, the devil is called the evil one, and in the parable itself it is said the birds devoured the seed. The birds signify, as already said, in this case, false thinking or evil thinking. If a man thinks in a false way, if he thinks evilly, how can he understand the teachings of esotericism? He himself is the devil. He himself is the evil one. Now let us change the idea of the devil into mechanicalness. If a man thinks mechanically, he cannot receive the ideas of esotericism. In the mechanical parts of a man, the birds devour the seeds, that is, destroy them. The whole thing is to keep esotericism away from mechanical thoughts, to value it, to lift it up, to make it, as it were, sacred, that is, a special thing, a holy thing, and this is the significance of a thing being made holy. Otherwise it falls on the wrong place in you, and is devoured and trodden underfoot. Understand that underfoot means in your own mind. You must think consciously of esotericism, and be conscious when you think of it. You cannot think of it always, at least to begin with, but you must not let yourself think of it mechanically, negatively, and so on. But there are certain forces that tend to keep man in habits, that is, in mechanicalness. They hang on mankind and keep people doing and saying and thinking the same things over and over again. For this reason you must make the ideas of esotericism stronger than the ideas of life. Otherwise the pressure of mechanical life will keep you literal, natural, sense-based, so that hearing the ideas of esotericism, you will reject them, think evilly about them, be suspicious, blind, deaf, and so on. You have only to try to speak to others of esotericism to see how the birds devour the seed. And if you are so poetical as to think that people cannot really think falsely and cannot really think evilly, then all I can say is that you have not yet begun to observe yourself sincerely and seen what you yourself are capable of. Part 5. We now come to the second category. The first category is the most externally based man, the man of the senses. The second category is more interior. Each category goes more and more inwards, that is, higher and higher vertically. The second category is described as follows in Matthew. And others, that is seeds, fell upon rocky places, where they had not much earth, and straightway they sprang up, because they had no deepness of earth. And when the sun was risen they were scorched, and because they had no root they withered away. Let us try to understand this category of man in regard to the sowing of the seeds of esoteric teaching in humanity. These are the people who have a certain kind of magnetic centre, which I will explain later. Let us first see how Christ is said to have interpreted this part of the parable. And he that was sown upon rocky places, this is he that heareth the word, and straightway with joy receiveth it, yet he hath no root in himself, but endureth for a while. And when tribulation and persecution ariseth because of the word, straightway he stumbleth. At first sight this describes the man who can face no difficulties in esotericism, either in himself or in the teaching itself. That is, he is a person who cannot work on himself, and who cannot work with others or bear their unpleasant manifestations. In following an esoteric teaching, there has to be, first, evaluation of the ideas of esotericism, then follows the application of the ideas to oneself, and on this will follow necessarily the realization of one's own personal difficulties. If a man reaches so far, he realizes that his difficulties are not due to others, but lie in himself. If he does not get violent or depressed, he may pass further, because he can find the force to go on, and not waste his force in complaining and finding fault and in being offended. But this second category means something more than shallow enthusiasm. It strikes far deeper in its meaning. In its deeper meaning, the man sown in rocky places is the man who only follows knowledge. He is the man who works only on the line of knowledge. You must work, and that means make effort, to get the knowledge of esoteric ideas into your minds. This opens up new connections. But you must also work on being, on yourself, on the kind of man you are. If you are a violent man, you must work on that. If you are a morose man, you must work on that. If you nourish yourself with negative emotions, you must change that, and so on. A man who works only on the side of knowledge is one-sided. When human difficulties arise, he breaks. He knows, but cannot do. Why cannot he do? Because his level of being, the kind of man he is far below his level of knowledge. That is the man meant in the parable. He is the man who is sown on rocky ground. Rocks, stones, in the language of parables, stand for knowledge, or let us call it the knowledge of truth, or truth alone. The rock of ages means eternal truth. By truth is meant the knowledge of esotericism, not ordinary life truth, but the special truth relating to transformation of man, that is, esoteric truth. But, nor again, does special knowledge, unless you apply it to yourself. For you yourself are the subject of the knowledge. You are the experiment. A man who has some magnetic centre receives the knowledge of esotericism with joy. He wants to hear all about it and compare it with other esoteric ideas he has studied. But when he has to apply it to himself, because he has no emotional root, he wilts and fades. Knowledge must become emotional to affect us. Esoteric ideas must reach the emotional part of us to influence us. The man in the parable wishes to keep everything as knowledge and get the satisfaction of knowing about truth. He is theoretical. He can hear the word but cannot do it, and does not try to do it. He likes to hear new ideas about esotericism and so on. He can see the difference between esoteric ideas and life ideas, but it all remains in his mind only. His magnetic centre is in the region of knowledge only. When the sun is arisen, that is, when persecution and tribulation come, he is weak. He cannot face his inner difficulties, his negativeness, his doubts, his inner persecutions and tribulations, and so he cannot fight for esotericism in himself, and so can bear no fruit. This is the second category. It is extraordinary to notice people of this category, how they go from teacher to teacher, how they take up now this with joy, and then you hear they are taking up something else with equal enthusiasm. And in talking to them, you find only a mass of odd bits of knowledge, often very confused and without any practical application. Their interest lies only in picking up certain kinds of ideas, but they do not feel the depths of these ideas or their own relation to them, and as soon as things become difficult they run away and take up some other ideas. It is little else than a kind of mental curiosity about esotericism. The whole thing is still external with them, not so external as with the first category, but external internal. If they meet a teaching that gives them a personal shock, they are offended. This is the meaning of the phrase, when persecution or tribulation ariseth because of the word, straightway he stumbleth. To stumble means in the Greek to be offended, to be scandalized. The person becomes negative, pities himself, talks badly, cannot see any connection between what he has been taught and how he is behaving. As was said, the Rock of Ages means, in the language of parables, eternal truth. And you will remember that the disciple Simon was renamed by Christ. He was called Peter, which in the Greek is Petros, meaning stone or rock. Of Peter, Christ said, "On this rock I will found my church." Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. Peter had knowledge and could remember it, but it was not yet emotional, so Christ told him he had as yet no faith and would deny him. And because he was only a man of knowledge, a man of truth, but capable of deeper understanding, Christ had to teach him what forgiveness meant. This is why 2 parables about forgiveness are addressed to Peter. For a man based on truth alone is harsh and unmerciful. He forgives no one. And this is why it is said, after the denial of Christ, that Peter wept. He wept because the teaching of Christ became at that moment emotional. He saw it no longer merely as knowledge. What had been intellectual penetrated to the emotional level in him. He saw himself in the light of the knowledge he had been taught. He saw the distance that lay between what he knew and what he was. In place of merely knowing, he began to understand. The allusion to Peter made here is only in connection with the meaning of rock or stone in the language of parables, and so with the significance of Simon's being renamed Peter, that is, stone or rock. I am not saying that Peter belonged to the second category in the parable of the sower, for when tribulation and persecution arose, he had root in himself. But at first he believed only through his teacher and not from himself. Rock represents a primitive level of truth that does not quench the thirst. The hungry and thirsty are often mentioned in Scripture. Without knowledge of truth, a man is said to thirst. Nor can rock satisfy this thirst. From rock, water must be struck, as Moses struck it. Christ says that the man who believes shall never thirst. In the book of Amos it is said that a famine is coming on the land, and it is expressly explained that it is not a famine of bread, nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of God. That's in Amos chapter 8, verse 11. It is plain beyond doubt that all these words, famine, land, thirst, have a psychological reference, and are not literal in meaning. In the following passage, lack of truth is again represented as famine and thirst. They regard not the work of the Lord, neither have they considered the operation of his hands. Therefore my people are gone into captivity for lack of knowledge. Their glory are men of famine, and their multitude are parched with thirst. Isaiah chapter 5, verses 12 to 14. Lack of the knowledge of truth, a psychological state, is represented in the visual language of parables by famine and lack of water, which give rise to bodily states. Part 6. The third category is formulated in the parable in these words: "And others fell upon the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them." In his interpretation of this verse, Christ is made to say, "And he that was sown among the thorns," that is, he that heareth the word, and the care of the world, and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it becometh unfruitful. In Mark, "and the lusts of other things entering and choke the word," is added to the interpretation. And in Luke the interpretation of Christ is given as, "These are they that have heard the word." To hear means to understand. "And as they go on their way, they are choked with cares and riches and pleasures of this life, and bring no fruit to perfection." In this category, people who hear and understand esotericism are referred to, but their emotional part is wrong. In the second category, those sown on rocky ground has reference to the intellectual part. In this third category, attention is drawn to the emotional part. Thorns refer to the emotional side, to the side of the emotional interest. When Christ says in another place, "Ye shall know them by their fruits," do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? The same idea appears. The thorns and thistles represent the emotional life. Wrong emotions cannot produce good fruit. Nor can you expect fruit from people whose ordinary emotional interests override the emotional interest and valuation required for esoteric teaching to develop in them. The magnetic centre in the emotional part is not strong enough. The crown of thorns placed on Christ's head before the crucifixion has an identical meaning. It represents the state of those who crucified him. Christ was crucified by those who could understand, and even did, but emotionally could not develop his teaching, being always distracted by intrigues, jealousies, by fears, by the lust for power, etc., called here thorns, and in other places briars or thistles, to which also belongs the ideas of cares, anxieties, and negative emotions. The crown of thorns represented the general emotional state of humanity at that time. They were choked emotionally by self-interest, and although many of them could understand Christ's teaching, they could not give it any room. The will side of them, which springs out of the state of a man's emotional centre and changes with his emotional development, was such that they could not let the teaching of Christ act upon them in any real way, that is, become the first thing emotionally. For if you do not feel emotional enough about knowledge, it cannot touch the side of your being, that is, it cannot act on you. It will have no power over you. In other words, although you may feel it to some extent emotionally, you cannot apply your knowledge and begin to live it. Other emotional interests are too strong. This idea is expressed in many parables, namely the idea of what is really most important to you emotionally. The emotions make a thing important, that is, valued, loved, coveted, sought after. The image in the parable means that a man who is very identified with life and whose main emotional interests are concerned with himself and his position in life grows thorns in himself, which not only hurt and pain him, but choke any emotional development. Such a man has magnetic centre in the emotional part of him, but it is not strong enough and is swamped by all the cares and anxieties of life and all that life seems to offer. He can and does understand, but he is sown in life in such a way that nothing can happen. Now all these categories so far considered, the man who understands nothing, the man who understands intellectually, the man who understands emotionally, but not enough, also represent more deeply the different stages of a single man in his relation to esotericism. But of this we will speak later. Part 7. After the three categories of people mentioned in the parable of the sower and the seed, who cannot undergo inner evolution, because they have been sown into the world in such a manner as to make this impossible, a further 3 categories are defined. These form one class, being those who are sown on good ground and yield fruit, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. Of these Christ says in his interpretation of the parable, "And he that was sown upon the good ground, this is he that heareth the word and understandeth it, who verily beareth fruit, and bringeth forth some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Matthew chapter 13, verse 23. In all, 4 kinds of ground are described in the parable. The ground called the wayside, the ground called rocky, the ground choked with thorns, and good ground. Those seeds sown in bad ground produce no fruit, while those sown in good ground produce fruit in 3 degrees, represented by the numbers 100, 60, and 30. You will notice an inversion here, for it would have been more natural to expect the order the other way round, culminating in those who produce more fruit. In the accounts given in Mark and Luke, the inversion does not appear. In Mark, Christ is made to give the interpretation in these words: "And those are they that were sown upon the good ground, such as hear the word and accept it, and bear fruit 30-fold, and 60-fold, and 100-fold." Mark chapter 4, verse 20. And in Luke, "And that in the good ground, these are such as in an honest and good heart, having heard the word, hold it fast, and bring forth fruit with patience." Luke chapter 8, verse 15. In the account of this part of the parable itself, Luke writes, "And other fell into the good ground, and grew, and brought forth fruit 100-fold. As he said these things, he cried, He that hath ears to hear, let him hear." Luke chapter 8, verse 8. The interpretation of the parable put into the mouth of Christ varies in each of the evangelists. For instance, Luke does not understand that man himself is sown into life differently, and so gives the interpretation as, "Those by the wayside are they that have heard," and "Those on the rock are they which, when they have heard, received the word with joy," and so on. Whereas both Matthew and Mark speak of people being sown into life differently, some being sown by the wayside, some on rocky ground, and so on, and the word of God being sown in turn upon them with quite different results. The Gospels were written long after Christ's crucifixion. Luke never saw Christ. He was originally a follower of Paul, who was not taught by Christ, but possibly got what teaching he had from one school near Damascus. The closer a gospel is to the original source of teaching, the fuller and richer the language of its parables. If we look at the curious inversion of numbers in Matthew as having some significance not understood by Mark or Luke, it might be considered that it is the gospel that is the closest to the source and to the original. But it is usually considered that Mark is the original gospel. The first 3 gospels are called synoptic, but this does not mean they were written by eyewitnesses, as often supposed. It means merely that they see eye to eye in contradistinction to the Gospel of John. If the Gospel of Matthew was written by the disciple Matthew, called originally Levi, the tax gatherer, then only this Gospel was written by an actual eyewitness of Christ. Mark and Luke were either not born or were little children when Christ died. It must be understood that the knowledge of the teaching given by Christ was preserved in schools, where people were taught orally and the teaching kept living, and that the date of the first publication of the teaching in written form is quite another question of secondary importance. The teaching about man's possible inner evolution and his real meaning on earth has always been kept alive in schools and preserved in this way throughout the ages. It emerges as stated intervals, or rather calculated periods in history. In religious or other forms, to give an impetus to lift mankind above the level of barbarism, to which it inevitably tends if left to itself, and so makes possible the development of art, science, and literature, so as to bring people to a certain normal level of understanding, which must be reached by at least some before any question of inner evolution begins to be possible. What we call our Christian culture, in which, historically speaking, various movements in art, literature, philosophy and science have been able to take place and would otherwise have been impossible, began with an impetus given partly by the carefully enacted drama of Christ and partly by the work of many others before and after. And although it may be true to say that there have been no Christians in the real sense, that is, people who attain the degree of inner evolution reached by Christ through endless temptations and through suffering quite apart from the death on the cross, it must not be forgotten that this impetus was the source of a gradual organization of life which raised man, outwardly, above the level of barbarism and made possible a civilization. Let us now return to the general idea of the parable of the sower, before seeking for the meaning of the good ground, for parts and details cannot be understood save in relation to the good idea as a whole. The parable as a whole is about the teaching of the inner evolution of man, and the categories of people defined in it refer to the possibilities of people differently placed, or sown, in life with regard to receiving and understanding this teaching, and undergoing the inner evolution that it is concerned with. Behind every parable there lies a general idea, and the details and language vary in meaning according to it. Everything in this parable is said in reference to the general idea that first, there is a teaching, called here the word, and second, that some cannot and some can understand this word or teaching, and out of those who can, some accept it fully and apply it. The latter are called those sown on good earth, and these can bring forth fruit to perfection. Now, a teaching about inner evolution necessarily is about a man himself. The man himself is the subject of the experiment. It is he who must evolve through the knowledge and application of the truth about inner evolution. Only in this way can he produce fruit. The seed of the word grows in him. At the same time, he himself is a seed that can grow through the seed of the teaching sown in him, and the seed of the word cannot grow in him unless he grows or evolves himself. That is, as he grows in himself, the seed of the word grows. This may be difficult to understand at first, for people take knowledge or truth quite apart from themselves, that is, apart from the kind of people they are. The idea that there is an order of knowledge or truth that cannot be understood aright save through a personal development of oneself by means of it seems strange. Yet, if you think of it, it is obvious that if there is a teaching about self-evolution, it must involve an evolution of oneself. Its art must be applied to oneself. The artist and the subject he works upon are all one. Now, no one will ever take the trouble to apply any sort of knowledge of whatever the order unless he sees the good of it. If a man does not see the good of a thing, he will not learn much about it. Or he may learn something, but finding it difficult to apply, give it up. What makes a man strong in whatever he does in connection with his knowledge is his own conviction of the good of it. If he has no deep conviction of the good of a thing, even though he may be intellectually interested in it as a form of knowledge or truth, it will have no real weight with him. We have seen that the category in the parable defined as those sown on rocky ground are of this nature. They receive truth but have no depth of earth. That is, they cannot see the good of it enough, and once too many difficulties arise, their interest withers away. It is only those who are classified as being sown in good earth that produce fruit. To have good earth means to have the power of seeing the good. To see the good of the word sufficiently, that is, the knowledge that teaches the truth about inner evolution or the kingdom of heaven, which is within a man, is possible only to this category. The first category in the parable, those sown by the wayside, cannot see any good in it. The idea of inner evolution means nothing to them. The second category, those sown on rocky ground, see a little good in it. The third category, those sown among thorns, see good too much in other things, in all the cares and preoccupations of life. The last category see the good in different degrees, but in every case see it enough to produce fruit. Fruit means to bring to fruition in themselves, or fruition in themselves, the teaching of inner evolution. They themselves are the fruit through their own evolution. It is the same case with many things in nature that evolve mechanically. A grub becomes a butterfly, but this is mechanical. It happens. In the case of man, his possible evolution to a higher state of himself does not happen. He must labour consciously, but as in the case of the grub, it is he himself that is the subject of the experiment in this inner metamorphosis or transformation that the Gospels emphasize so clearly as the real goal of man. Man as he is earth. Man, having undergone inner transformation, is heaven. When people use the Lord's Prayer and say, "May thy will be done on earth as in heaven," they are really praying for this transformation in themselves without knowing it. They are praying for the fullest possible fruition of their own lives, of themselves. But the earth in a man is of different qualities. It is in some merely the wayside, in some rocky ground, in some it is choked with thorns, and in some it is good earth. For in order to change, a man must first of all be able to receive this teaching about inner change on his natural level, in his own earth. The seed must find a right soil, and the soil is the kind of man. As we have seen, in this respect there are different kinds of man, or different soils. Truth falling on man as a seed by itself is powerless. Truth must find the right soil. This truth, this knowledge, this teaching about inner evolution must unite with good to develop and grow. This means a man must be able to see the good of the truth he is taught, or otherwise nothing can take place. To be able to see the good of any form of knowledge is something quite different from being good. In a way, it has nothing to do with being good, but rather with having the power of good. To be able to see the value of a thing is to have good, that is, to have the power of seeing its worth. This is goodness. And this is the fundamental conception of good in the Gospels. Every form of knowledge, every form of truth, must find and unite with its proper good to become living. Every truth has its own particular good, and man is the point where they can meet and unite. Good and truth must unite to produce fruit. When a man begins to see the good of some truth he had been taught, then a union between what he knows and what he is begins to take place. This is because a man is unable to will anything unless he feels it to be good. Merely to see a thing is true is not enough. He must will the truth, and for this to be possible he must see the good of the truth, the good of the knowledge he has been taught. Truth then becomes internally connected with him, so is made living. Then the more good he sees in it, the more will the truth grow and develop, and the more truth he sees, the more will the good he sees in it grow. But I will later on say more about the meaning of good and connect it with early Greek teaching. All these ideas are hidden in the parable of the sower, and many others as well, for a parable lies in the dimension of height and depth, and its meaning extends from the simplest outer, literal or external meaning to the highest possible inner meaning, only comprehensible in the highest state of consciousness, where language and imagery pass into pure meaning.